Hi, my name is Peter Green. Before there was a Silicon Valley in California, there was an Aire Valley in Yorkshire, England, and I witnessed its final death throes because of my first wife, Pat. When we just got engaged and were still at university, Pat took me home to meet her grandfather at her parents' house. When we entered the living room, there was a wizened, white-haired old gentleman sat in the chair reading his newspaper. The first thing he said to me, without lowering his newspaper, was, "Put wood in foil, lad," which was Yorkshire for "put the wood in the hole," or as translated by my wife Pat, "close the door," which I did. Pat introduced me as her fiance, and with that, Samuel Holmes begrudgingly lowered his newspaper and asked me, "Where you from, lad?" To which I replied, "London." Sam immediately raised his newspaper, indicating his displeasure with his granddaughter proposing to marry a Southerner. Then, after what seemed an eternity, Sam, with a big sigh, slowly lowered his newspaper again and asked, "Do you play cricket then?" To which I honestly replied, "Well, actually, no." Sam immediately raised his newspaper again to cover his face, and, to the best of my recollection, never spoke to me again. Such was my introduction to the remaining survivor of one of the great fortunes of the Industrial Revolution, now completely broke and living off a meager government pension. The Holmes and Whitely families were incredibly wealthy. In the late 19th century, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, they owned dozens of textile mills up and down the Aire Valley in Yorkshire, England. At the time, the Aire Valley was the Silicon Valley of its day, where all the wealth was being created by technical innovations of the Industrial Revolution. Theirs was like privately owning Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, to use a modern comparison. Sam could have been heir to all of this fortune, but instead, all Sam ever wanted was to be an artist. However, this was not to be. The patriarchs of the Holmes and Whiteley families decided they needed to join their business empires together by marrying Sam, the son of the Holmes empire, to the daughter Emilia of the Whiteleys. They also decided that Sam should come into the textile business, which Sam hated. Sam and Emilia were my wife Pat's grandparents. As I described previously, I met Sam as a little white-haired old man, but in his younger days, Sam was apparently a ladies' man and a drunkard with a fiery temper. Apparently, he got drunk on his wedding day and ended up fighting with the coachman in the ditch on the way to his and Amelia's honeymoon. For a while, Sam and Amelia lived the life of the wealthy elite. They lived in a large, stately home in the city of Bradford, with a long, curving approach drive through many acres of lawn, as befits a stately home which was maintained by an army of servants. The last time I visited what had been their townhouse, their manor house, was ironically now an art museum. In its day, it was a symbol of incredible wealth. In addition, Sam and Amelia also maintained a holiday home on the Isle of Man, which is in the middle of the Irish Sea, with a year-round staff of about 20 servants. Soon after their marriage, it quickly became apparent that Sam was not cut out for the life of a mill owner. As a result, the mill's patriarchs decided that running the mill was best left to other relatives and professional managers, and that Sam should find some other business endeavor more suited to his talents. So the families gave Sam a large amount of money to set up in the art glass importing business. He imported art glass from Leipzig in Germany and sold it in England. He was apparently modestly successful and was able to maintain his expensive lifestyle until the First World War came along in 1914 between England and Germany. Then he went bankrupt as his source of supply was cut off, and anyhow, nobody was very much interested in buying art glass in a time of war. After the war was over, the family lent him another large amount of money to go into the picture framing business for art, with the admonition that if he went bankrupt again, there would be no more money. Then, unfortunately, along came the Great Depression of the 1930s, and Sam went bankrupt again. Sam and Emilia had two children, Dorothy, who I knew, and a younger brother, Jeffrey, who also got to know. They both grew up in incredible luxury in a stately home with summers on the Isle of Man. Dorothy was Pat's mother, and Jeffrey her uncle. Dorothy was 12 at the time her father went bankrupt for the second time. Sam, on going bankrupt, made an appeal to the men in his and Emilia's families to lend them more money, but they said no. They had presumably warned Sam about his expensive lifestyle, and I suspect the mills were in deep trouble. This is the Depression, so there was probably little money to spare. But Dorothy saw this as a total betrayal of her personally by all the men in her life, shades of feminism, and thereafter deeply distrusted every man in her life, which actually, as it turned out, to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. As the family went bankrupt, Sam and Emilia had to move from their stately home to a small, mean, two-bedroom, back-to-back row house in a slum in Bingley, which at the time was where the workers who worked in the textiles mills lived. The house had only cold running water and was cold and dank. Sam took to, or more likely continued, to drink heavily. Emilia sank into a deep depression and took to her bed and never left it again, or so it is reported, until she died. Today, Bingley is a nice suburb of Bradford, a little way up the Aire Valley. Think Emily Bronte country, past Shipley, but at the time the term dark and satanic mills was an appropriate term. All the buildings were black and the air was thick with smoke. It was not a nice place to live, especially if you had been brought up in a stately home with servants to look after your every need. I do not know what happened in the years between the Great Depression and World War II, but I know that Dorothy, or Dot as she was known to her friends, ended up working in a baker's shop on the same parade of shops where Bill, who was Pat's father, ran his radio shop and repair business. This is where she met Bill just prior to the outbreak of World War II, but that is a story for another day. Emilia had died long before I met Pat, but I did get to meet Sam's sister Annie, who was a sweet little old lady who lived with her husband, who owned the last of the mills originally owned by the two families. Time had not been kind to the Holmes and Whitely business empire, and now it was down to one somewhat decrepit mill. Annie and her husband did not have any children, but her husband had brought a nephew of his into the business so the nephew could take over the last remaining mill when he died. We visited Annie a number of times when Pat and I were courting. She was Pat's favorite great aunt and still lived in a very comfortable life in a large house in the city of Bradford. Annie was always asking Pat to visit and bring that nice young man of hers with her. Pat always joked that Annie had the hots for me, and I am certain that, as a younger woman, Annie must have been incredibly attractive. Shortly after Pat and I married, Annie's husband died, and Annie died shortly thereafter. Her husband left the last mill to his nephew, but all the working cash he left to charity. As a result, the mill went bankrupt a few months later, and that was the end of the Holmes and Whitely textile mill empire. As a postscript, the ostensible reason the Holmes and Whitely woolen mill empire failed by the mid-20th century was due to lower price competition from mills in India and Pakistan, and also competition from synthetic yarns. At first, the mills imported workers from India and Pakistan to reduce labor costs. But then they moved production to India and Pakistan to cut costs even further until India and Pakistan became independent countries in 1949. And soon the mills were no longer owned by Yorkshire businessmen, but by savvy Indian businessmen. There were still woolen mills around in Yorkshire when I was living up in Yorkshire in the early 1960s after going to university. Most of them with Pakistani workers, but these mills were a mere shadow of the mill empires of the late 19th century. But by then, the whole place had changed from its earlier wealthy Silicon Valley image, as I quickly found out. One day, my car broke down in the city of Bradford, which is at the bottom end of the Aire Valley. And I went to a bright red British Telecom phone booth to call the AA, the English Automobile Association, to get a tow, as there were no cell phones back then. To my utter amazement, and somewhat disconcerting, all the instructions as to how to use the phone were written in Urdu, which by then was the predominant language spoken in the English city of Bradford, as the population by then were mostly Pakistani immigrants. Today, the UK has recently had an Indian Prime Minister, and all the fish and chip shops are run by Indians who have converted them into tandoori, Chinese, and fish and chip shops. Also, the largest Hindu temple in the world is in London. So we must ask, who colonized who? Also, even more would have been more disconcerting to Pat's granddad, the Indians always beat the English at cricket, which the English invented. But back to the Holmes and Whitely Mill Empire. What really finished this off was not globalization or competition from India or Pakistan, but the lack of an heir with the business acumen to take over their accumulated, very large fortune and to invest it in new ventures to enable the family fortunes to survive the vicissitudes of turbulent times, as they always are. Oh well, as they say in Yorkshire, clogs to clogs in 3 generations. The first generation starts the business, the second grows it to be a big successful business, and the third generation lives off the fortune built by the first two. And as a result, usually dissipates the fortune by spending way too much money on personal things, such that his or her children end up wearing wooden clogs, which were the cheapest shoes that poor people could buy back in the day. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed this. Please click on the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Thank you.